What's going on, people? We're back. It's another week. It's another episode of the Talkin TV podcast. I usually have a lot more of a colorful diatribe, but I'm currently exhausted. So, quick intros. I'm Dom. That's Chris, movie nerd, TV nerd. Chris, I hate my new job. And that's all I'm going to say on that. I literally just woke up from another 2-hour nap. My brain is barely conscious right now. But here's the thing is that once again, like everything that we do on this show, it still ties into the topic of today's episode because like these characters in this movie, I'm exhausted. I feel like I'm going in circles and I don't know who I can trust.
That is
Chris,
a good point.
Yeah, Chris, how have you been, first of all?
I've been good, back in school and trying to balance life and whatnot. But I mean, for the most part, man, look, I also hate your job, just for the record.
Yeah.
And I can't wait for you to get out of there. But hey, man, we still get episodes up every Wednesday.
Yeah.
Point in case being right now. So
Yeah,
as long as that keeps happening, I've been good.
Yeah, and it's another interesting thing about this week because this week, again, like a lot of other episodes that we've done, was supposed to be something completely different. And then due to recent events, we were like, nah, we got to do this because we watched a movie this past weekend it's another movie that I've been trying to get you to watch for a while. It personally is one of my favorite movies of all time. The more and more I think about it, it definitely is my favorite horror movie of all time. And what movie are we discussing today, Chris?
Today, we are talking about none other than John Carpenter's The Thing.
Yes, and we have to preface that it's John Carpenter's The Thing because, again, unfortunately, it's another movie that there's been multiple versions of. So we have to preface that today, even though the other versions of this movie will factor into our discussion, we are specifically talking about the 1982 masterpiece, in my opinion, that being John Carpenter's The Thing. So, Chris, even though you'd never seen this movie up to this point, this clearly was a movie that you had heard about. Not just from me, but from other people as well. So briefly go into your history of what you'd heard about this movie and whether that prepared you for just how awesome this actual movie was.
So you tried to prepare me, but I don't think anyone could quite prepare a human being who loves movies and TV as much as we do for the amazing journey that is this film. I mean, Dom, I was completely blown away, dude. Like I did sort of like a mini teaser spoiler or whatever. And I don't normally type out written reviews of anything. I hate writing in that regard.
I know. I saw you posted on Instagram about this immediately. I was like, whoa, this movie definitely had an impact on him.
A huge impact, man. And I still stand by what I said in that post. I need to go over my list of top 10 to 20 movies of all time and find a spot for this film in there. It is a phenomenal movie. And yeah, man, we're starting off a little earlier than expected with the spooky vibes today, but I'm all for it.
Well, considering how it's going to blend into, even though technically by the time this episode comes out, it will still be September. This episode blends perfectly into the theme of our next month, obviously, for our big event that we have coming up, which we have hinted at more than enough times, that being the big SHOCK-tober event,
Oh, yeah.
And it's funny because we tried to get this movie in on a watch along. It didn't really work out. And we were gonna originally, like I said, this week's episode was supposed to be something completely different. We were supposed to be discussing horror movies in general, the effect of horror that it has on us. A little bit of a throwback to an episode that was supposed to come out earlier in the year that we never ended up being released. And I was texting with you after this movie, and I'm like, nah, we gotta cover this movie. You finally saw it. Like, there's no way we can. We gotta cover this movie. And what's interesting is that usually when we come across situations like this, it's usually of something that we're kind of both a little familiar with, and it's usually a situation where we're both usually fanboying out really, really hard. And I'm not going to say it usually takes away from the discussion, but there's usually, to me, a clear distinction between the stuff that we really love, that we're fanboying out about, versus the stuff that we just kind of get into analytically. But this, I think, is going to be the one exception to that rule, because, again, people, compared to all the previous podcasts, look at all those notes. Look at all those notes that I have just for this one movie. This is my second time watching this movie in its entirety. I watched this movie for the first time 2 years ago now. Wow. Up at school. And I remember, obviously, the big thing that stood out to me, first off, this being directed by the great John Carpenter. And I'm going to use that word because this man, arguably, I'd say it's between him and Wes Craven as far as like the director who's had the biggest impact on the horror genre in general in Hollywood, because obviously Wes Craven has kind of a more like of a traditional outlook with the Nightmare on Elm Street, and the Scream movies got a little bit of like wanted to explore like the base bare bones of certain horror. John Carpenter's whole thing is that besides being known for making some incredible stories on some extremely low budgets and some extremely kind of basic formulas, John Carpenter was kind of the guy that, like, to me at least, almost invented a genre. Although, like basically like kind of wrote the rules on the slasher genre with the original Halloween. But obviously some other incredible efforts like Escape from New York, They Live, Assault on Precinct 13, In the Mouth of Madness, Vampires, to name a few. The guy's got a very, very distinct filmography, to say the least. But the thing that immediately stood out when I watched this movie is, wow, this movie... And again, it's going to sound crazy because it's a movie about a shape-shifting alien. This movie feels real. And again, it's really, really difficult when you try to discern that, especially when it comes to horror movies, because so many horror movies involve supernatural or these types of otherworldly creatures and threats. But the thing that immediately stood out to me, it's two things. One, the atmosphere / bottle setting, which we'll talk about, which is the idea that because it's in primarily an isolated setting that's kind of separated from the rest of the world in a way that's actually believable, because so much of the time we see these horror movies exist in a way that it's like, okay, like, why is nobody else reacting? You know, that's why you usually see a lot of horror movies take place in like a small town or like some kind of an isolated setting in order to compensate for that. But this is really interesting because this movie takes place in Antarctica, in a whole different type of isolated setting. You know, the literal bottom of the world, this completely frozen tundra, cut off from the rest of the world. And it just adds to me more to the characters' frustrations, other than the fact that, you know, they've been infiltrated by this parasitic shape-shifting alien. It's the fact of not only in the Antarctic, isolated from everyone else, it's there in the Antarctic, isolated from everyone else, and it's about to become the middle of winter. Like, it's like every possible worst thing that you could get that these characters have to go up with. And as for the characters themselves, I really enjoy how, with the exception of Kurt Russell, Keith David, and Wilford Brimley, there are no, like, giant stars in this movie. All of them are primarily character actors. They've all got, like, these one-word, very basic character names, you know, but through their, like, very minuscule character actions, they kind of all get you to, like, become really endeared to them. And as a result, you kind of feel something even more once they start getting picked off one by one. Those are just two primary observations that I have off the top of my head when it comes to this movie.
Yeah, no, those are definitely two solid observations. And before we sort of dive into your notes there and really just take this thing and run with it, we do have to say, though, as we're still sort of in the top of the show here, that if you are upset that you're going to be missing out on our general horror discussion and its impact, that's okay, because we're going to be on the Brando show. And that's literally, aside from sort of telling everyone about the SHOCK-tober event and really diving in for the first time about this huge community event we have planned in Halloween, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, that's your chance to get that episode. And of course, we're going to do it along with one of our great friends here on YouTube, Brando, aka the Brando Critic. So Dom, what's the date on that again? So people can be at the first ever Brando show. Essentially, it's the Joe Rogan experience of cinephiles.
2 days from now, when this episode goes up, this episode will be up on Wednesday the 30th. 2 days from now, Friday, October 2nd at 9 p.m. sharp on the Brando Show YouTube channel.
Yeah. It's going to be awesome. And we'll put the link to that in this description. So, Dom, man, I got to ask you, since, you know, you introduced this movie into my life and, quite frankly, with this movie changed my life and made it better. Where do
I love that.
You brought up well, I mean, it's the truth, man. And so you brought up a few interesting sentiments, some observations. But where do you really want to start with taking the plunge into this film?
Well, first, I just want to know, like, because this movie overall, structure-wise, it's not too different from most other horror movie setups. But I want to ask you what it is that you think about this specific setup that kind of helps differentiate this from other horror movies, kind of more traditional based horror movies, you know, that kind of helps add to this movie's legacy. Because this movie has garnered quite a legacy in and of itself.
Yeah, no, totally. Real quick, before I dive in and give you my answer, define what you mean by traditional, as I feel the line can often get blurred here.
Well, obviously the idea that kind of, if you think about it, this movie structure-wise, it does have a slasher kind of setup, like kind of a bottle film setup, certain amount of characters. There is a killer within there. The killer does pick off said characters one by one, but it is a finite set of characters, right? And I just want to know what you think, how this film manages to differentiate itself by getting you to care about characters in certain ways that most general slashers wouldn't, how it factors its setting into that, and overall, again, just specifically with the killer itself.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean now. I think I have to just start off by, sort of prefacing with the fact that I think that John Carpenter quite literally changed the way horror films were created and perceived, and impacted creators spanning as recently as, Dave Franco with his directorial debut with The Rental, and in 2008, I believe was the year, or maybe 11. I get my Cloverfields mixed up, but nonetheless, 2008, the incredible 10 Cloverfield Lane. I mean,
10 Cloverfield Lane was 2016. The original Cloverfield was 2008.
Yeah. That's the bottle.
Now you're confusing me.
And I also think, aside from just popularizing bottle films in horror, I think, if you look at one of my favorite Tarantino films, right, Reservoir Dogs, which is a phenomenal movie. I mean, I just think, because of where he was in the history of cinema, and how he used the concept of a one set location, because it's notorious, the fact that horror films have a low budget, because quite literally they are super high risk, high reward. They could easily flop, because it's one of those things in art. And we spoke about this on our interview last week with Jeffrey Bryan of Survivor and Karate Kid fame. Go and check that one out.
Subtle plug, cough, cough.
Yeah. Well, we kind of spoke about the fact that, like, if it's not genuine, you can sniff it out from a mile away. And especially with horror, I think believability is a huge factor, especially in the modern day. I think a lot of these young creators think they can get away with just how far technology's come in regards to CGI and prosthetics. And there's not really a story there that grips you and pulls you in. So I really think Carpenter could be credited a lot with sort of not only creating this medium of bottle films, certainly getting the slasher genre off the ground in a whole, but not only paving the way for younger creators and giving us awesome films like 10 Cloverfield Lane and The Rental's kind of growing on me. That's a conversation for end of the year. But, it's just like, without him, man, I don't think people would be pushing the boundaries of horror the way they have been. Because it's, at this point in time, horror was still fighting to get to where it is today, where it's like, I would say, among our age group, especially, one of the most coveted and sought after genres. So this was a very pivotal moment in horror's history. Thank God John Carpenter was around for it, right?
Yeah, it's funny because when we talk about genres overall that keep surviving and that can keep putting butts in seats overall, you and I have talked obviously a lot about how streaming keeps seeming to kill the traditional theater-going experience. Horror, to me, with the exception of a few movies, never really seems to have that problem, especially now with this past decade, and obviously the new directors that have been able to put their new spins on that genre. But John Carpenter, to me, was kind of already starting that again with the original Halloween, that being kind of like this, like, kind of very, very zeitgeisty type movie. Obviously the Academy Awards were never going to recognize it. Horror is one among many of almost every single genre that's not soapy drama that they don't recognize. But again, the original Halloween was a very cultural moment, obviously both for what it did for the horror genre overall, for instigating a genre that I hate with the slasher subgenre. But to me, this is absolutely his magnum opus because, again, like I was saying before, besides those two categories overall, it helps to me contribute to something that this movie does really well, which is this movie, again, for a movie about a shape-shifting alien parasite, this movie feels very legitimately real, and I really love how the movie starts off again, in Antarctica, and it kind of draws you in with the mystery, because for the first third of this movie, first half of this movie, I would say this movie is a mystery. Like, these guys, again, they're just chilling in this one research facility miles from the nearest civilization, like millions of miles. All of a sudden, they see this dog getting chased through the snow by this random helicopter with these Norwegians, and they're like, what the hell is going on? These guys are shooting at them. They have to defend themselves. After they do this, Kurt Russell's literally like, first goddamn day of winter. They're just like, come on, what is going on? Needless to say, things don't change that way, but I love how even before the film gets into all of its horror shenanigans, it draws you in with its mystery. It shows Kurt Russell as Mac, the eponymous everyday man as they're flying to the facility, trying to figure out what happened. And they find that the facility's a mess. They're like, what the hell happened? You know, you have that iconic shot where they find the one guy who's frozen with his throat cut, like the dried blood flowing down his arms. And that's already a powerful enough illusion. Like, the movie does a very good job of drawing you in with its mystery, you know? And so, again, like I said, you've heard about this movie ad nauseum. Like, what were your thoughts? Like, just with those images, forget the rest of the movie, just with those opening images, were you like, what the hell is going on? Like did it start to like gestate in your brain a little bit?
So, yeah, it did, because I think the set design and the mise en scène, as they like to call it in film school, was phenomenal. I mean, just the way that they took Antarctica and gave it so much life with how they, you know, the interior decoration of the base, and it felt so lived in. And I think there's a reason why, you know, you always say when speaking about this film, the characters feel so real. And I think that is in part their acting, but I also think it's just the believability of it all, because it's a very hard thing to believe, right? A shape-shifting alien that's almost parasitic in nature, that you would just have reason to believe goes from planet to planet, just sort of destroying life and moving on to the next thing it can devour, right? I mean, pretty simple. We've heard that before. We've seen that before, but I think why it works in this situation is because the humans that we get to, you know and love and watch go literally insane, they don't feel like actors. Like you said a bunch while we were watching it, you know, and I think that's a lot due to their performance, but I also think it's just the attention and the care and detail and the prosthetics, right? You got to remember, this is 1980. I mean,
82. Yeah.
82. Yeah, exactly. The 80s, and CG's come a long way since.
Yeah.
And there's really barely any, if any, in this film. I didn't notice any. And so it's just all facets of this. The filmmaking in this movie are just firing on all cylinders. They just complement, every small detail complements the next one so perfectly. And that's really what blew my mind at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's interesting because, again, this movie came out in 82, which was already a packed year, to say the least. We talked a lot about, obviously, the 80s, how that's your favorite decade. We've talked a lot specifically about 82 and what a powerhouse year that was. But these are just some of the movies that were this movie's competition that year. Just 82 specifically. E.T. the Extraterrestrial, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, Blade Runner, Poltergeist, 48 Hours, Dark Crystal, Rocky III, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, First Blood, Conan the Barbarian. This movie had a lot of competition, to say the least. That's a stacked lineup overall. And it's funny because this, like a couple of other 80s movies that exist now that we love, that our generation thinks is unbelievable and groundbreaking and amazing, this movie was not well received when it came out initially, which, looking back, we're like, what the hell? What were those people smoking? This movie is crazy. But what's interesting is that, specifically from, you know, who many consider to be one of the greatest living critics ever, Roger Ebert, the movie was particularly harshly criticized for being too nihilistic, especially since it came out only like a week apart from E.T. And I get it, you know, it was the 80s. People wanted, you know, all fun times, happy, fantasy. You know, they wanted the cute little alien that would like had fun with the little kid.
Between these two films.
Exactly. Not the, not the shape-shifting alien parasite that assimilated people and then would kill them. But again, if anything, I feel like, in a weird way, the movie was arguably more relevant at the time because we were still in the middle of Cold War America. It had a lot of Cold War themes, you know, a little bit of those Invasion of the Body Snatcher vibes where you're there with your fellow man, but you don't know who to trust, you know, a little bit of Big Brother involved there. Again, it was like the movie was really ahead of its time, and for such a simple premise, such a simple setup, for it to have those themes, to me at least, that is where the true horror comes from. Like, don't get me wrong, when the creature comes out, when the thing is revealed, it is revealed, and it is scary as shit, you know, like just from a sound design and a visual standpoint alone. But it's something that we've talked about with horror a lot, which is the idea of the true fear is always what you can't see, not what you can see, and that idea of constantly being scared of the fact that you can't trust your fellow man, especially in such an isolated setting. That, to me, is more terrifying than anything else, especially when you get to those scenes where they're all strapped down in that one room and they're all taking the blood sample tests and you don't know which one of them it's going to turn out to be. And like the way that they explain it all, it's very, very well thought out and very well conceived.
Yeah, that felt so easy to explain in the moment. The writing was phenomenal because you couldn't argue the concept being false at all, you know, to just whip that type of thing up. And I love when movies can explain scientific theories in a way where it doesn't take away from you watching the film. You don't have to stop and think. You were told the information in a perfect way, sort of like that exposition machine that they had at one point.
The literal exposition machine.
But it was perfect, and it was because there's a lot that they needed to sort of clue you in on as the film developed and the plot thickened, so you could really, you know, keep up with what the characters were thinking and the decisions they make. And it wasn't confusing. It was so just coherent, man. I love it. Great writing, super woven together in such a way that like you're not ripping that fabric at all. It is bulletproof in a sense.
Yeah, speaking of writing, the film was the writing credit is credited to officially to Burt Lancaster. This movie went through a couple different drafts, a couple different director ideas before it finally landed on Carpenter's choice. And the film, like I said, contributing to kind of the legacy that it spawned was actually a remake of a 1950s B horror movie thing called The Thing from Outer Space, which, again, that one, I'm not going to say that this movie improves upon that one too much, but that one, the take was a lot different. It was a lot campier. Obviously, it was shot in black and white. The actual creature itself was like this giant, like, Frankenstein monster-esque thing. The characters were a lot more like, see, we're going to stop it, you know? Like one of those, like, very high, you know the type, like those, like, 1940s-esque, like, fast-talking type things. But by this one, again...
Another great impression, Dom.
One of these days, I will finally get the proper recognition for my talent. But yeah, but the whole thing is that this was adapted from a John W. Campbell Jr. novella, right? And the whole thing to me, that this movie to me, almost in a weird way, felt more homage to that than the original movie, because obviously the big thing is one of the biggest TV shows on at the time was The Twilight Zone, which is obviously a show that week to week would use different these kind of high concept, whether it be extraterrestrials or anything supernatural, in order to sell like kind of the satire of the time, you know. And this to me again was in a way did a better job with that than the original black and white version that this did, which is that, again, the idea that you're stuck in close proximity, you don't know who to trust. You know, these people that have worked together, that have gotten to know each other pretty well, now all of a sudden, any one of them could turn out to be this shape-shifting alien. And so that, to me, brings us, again, to the big reveal. Again, the Norwegians, they were chasing this dog. They brought this dog into the base. They're like, for the most part, they're just chilling and going throughout their day. This dog is going down. You even pointed out, you were like, wow, even that dog is a good actor. I'm like, I know, right? That's one of the best damn animal performances I've ever seen.
Ever.
Like,
phenomenal,
ever.
Dude.
And then all of a sudden, of course, we get to the eponymous, the epic dog cage moment. The first revelation of what this thing, pun intended, really is. When you have Clark, that poor guy, bringing the dog to its cage, and then all of a sudden it's there with the rest of the dogs, and you can clearly tell something's up, because this dog, you can tell, you're like, okay, this is not a regular dog, because all the other dogs are sleeping, they're kind of tired, and this thing is just looking right at the wall, and then all of a sudden you hear that noise. And I mean, you're a sound guy, so even you have to give credit where credit is due to that overall natural ambiance. And then we get the shape-shifting scene. Like, walk me through your thoughts when that scene happened.
Well, you know, I can't say that I was completely blindsided by that event happening, because they were kind of hinting at the dog. That shot of it specifically comes to my brain when they're all sort of sitting around drinking and playing pool, and some of the men are playing cards at the table, and the general guy, or the commander there, he says, get that thing out of here, to the dog. And they were cutting to the dog, and so they were alluding to it, but I really didn't think it was going to go down the way it did, though. I mean, for 1982, right? That was gruesome. That was prosthetic work at its finest.
Yeah.
Terrifying, to be honest with you. And it's a little hard for us. I think we've been spoiled again with computer generated images and all that good stuff. But you got to like sort of put yourself in the mindset of the viewer of that time, I think, because it was terrifying, like you said. And it's nothing like, for example, some of the crazy nonsense we've seen in this decade. There's been some horrifying computer generated images, but like for the time, honestly, they knocked it out of the park. Like, it was brilliant, man.
Yeah, shout out to Rob Bottin, who is the special effects guy for this movie.
For real.
And again, it's funny because the whole thing is that the behind the scenes of this movie, I think they actually went over budget a couple times. You know, like John Carpenter is a guy, he's become very well known for having those very tight, very, very small budgets. It usually shows in his movies, but oh man, like, let me tell you something. I don't remember how many different models they had to work with in order to get that one thing right. I know with just that one scene alone, they had to construct something like 13 different models. There were like a couple different ways that they had to shoot it. Like there's a reason why when you first see the thing, like when they first see it, and then when it reaches up with those giant claws, you know, they're like, that's like puppeteering, reaching up through the ground. And then when you actually see it going up the side, that's like another, like a completely separate model that's going up. And then when it's like a mess, like on the wall, and you just see this disgusting thing, it's like layers upon layers of an opening, like just the pure imagination that goes into it. And I'm like, yeah, you could probably do this with CG and it would probably be easier, especially now, but it definitely wouldn't have the same effect because, again, to me, I always give way more props to those guys who are able to come up with like that puppeteering, that concept modeling. You know, overall, it adds just so much more legitimacy to that, you know, because you actually believe you're there with the characters in that spot. You're actually there seeing something real in that mindset. So in a way, their fear becomes even more believable, you know, as a sense.
Yeah, I agree. Was it one of those things where, you know, like in the old films sometimes where they would have like a head-on collision, a car would get rammed by a truck and it'd be like miniatures, but they'd make it look so real? Was that kind of like what they had to do at this point in time, or had the technology progressed a little further in regards to like managing scale and whatnot?
I know for a fact that there were no miniatures, but I know for a fact, again, I would have to do more research. I'm not a special effects guy at all, but I know, again, like, every
fact, so I had to ask.
I know. There were like every different type of like special effects that could have been used in this movie was used. Like it was, I even pointed out moments of stop motion to you, like with the tentacles reaching out. Like I said, there was like all like so many different forms of puppeteering and models, you know, because again, this thing, it's a dog at one point, you know, it's like this giant like mass at one point, you know, when they're doing the dissection scenes on it, like trying to break it down, trying to figure out what it is. And then you get Wilford Brimley pulling that thing out, you know, like explaining how the assimilation works. It's funny because for the longest time, for me personally, I was really confused, and I'm like, but wait a minute, how does it like take them in and absorb them and then shapeshift? I'm like, so wait, does it eat them and then mimic? Like it was a lot to process overall because it's very, very confusing kind of how it works. Again, thank God for the literal exposition machine literally kind of telling us and explaining exactly what goes down. But again, it's some really interesting but scary stuff where, again, if you get within too much close proximity to this thing, I mean, you saw it with the Bennings character where, especially when that thing is still alive, it basically like absorbs you in and then basically, for lack of a better word, eats you and then shapeshifts in order to form you. And the worst part is that it can literally do that from like the smallest tissue blood cell size. So even if you get some of that thing's blood on you, like you're basically done for, you know? Like you saw that with the Norris character too.
Yeah, it almost has very eerie similarities to 2020, but in regards to pandemic and whatnot,
slowly
really
eat you alive, just like.
But yeah, you're right, man. You know, I think the exposition machine came at the perfect time because I think you're left in the dark for quite some time, but it's still interesting because they're still feeding you little bits of the breadcrumb trail as you're going along. But then it gets to the point where it's like, okay, we got to strap them in here. It's about to become a wild ride, so we got to get them on board, and all bets are off. And my favorite shot, man, speaking of the prosthetics and the special effects, was when I forget the redhead guy was sort of in the back of that storage closet, and they have like the towel over the body, and you just see underneath the body it move for the first time.
Yeah,
and I was like, whoa, this movie's about to get even crazier, because that was after the exposition machine.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh, okay. So they didn't give it all away.
Yeah.
And so just like watching the way that the information was distributed in this film was really good writing to me. I thought it was awesome.
And like you saw like the individual character reactions to like after the initial dog scene, right? You had them like kind of looking over the one leftover dog, you know, with the Wilford Brimley, the Blair character with the Clark character. And he's like, how long were you in close proximity with the dog for? And even though he doesn't specifically say it, you could see the wheels churning in his mind. Like, oh, if this happened and it was going after the dogs like this, imagine what it could do for the human. And if this thing could imitate a human, like this thing perfectly imitated a dog without any of us knowing, and if it can imitate a human that way, and then you see that with when it gets to the Bennings character, who I believe is the first human that it begins to assimilate, and they manage to stop it and kill it before it fully assimilates. But as you see later on, if it had assimilated Bennings, they never would have known it, you know? And yeah, it's just how it slowly builds to that. And then later on with Blair sitting down in front of the machine and kind of plugging his findings in, and then showing, again, with I think a little bit too much advanced technology for 1982. I mean, I wasn't alive during that time, but I think you could say like whether or not like that computer was actually like realistic for the time. But again, all with no dialogue. Like Blair doesn't say a single word, but you just see the wheels churning in his head. Oh, Blair again is the smartest character in that entire movie, where he is able to figure out kind of what this thing is capable of before everyone else does. And as a result, he kind of takes steps in order to ensure that this thing does not leave the base, you know? And again, like, it's so 50-50 because, again, this is the brilliance of this movie, because that scene where he's destroying the radio equipment and you don't know whether he's gone insane. Like, the whole thing with there is that, is he doing that because he's already being taken over by it? Or is he doing that because he realizes that this thing is going to take over them slowly one by one, and he has to do this now so that he can prevent it from reaching the outside world, because as the exposition machine literally says, if this thing gets loose, like the world is gone, and like within like a matter of weeks, you know, that's how quickly this thing will spread.
27 days or something. And yeah, I was gonna bring that up. You know, the Doctor, in a sense, his own intelligence was his own demise. Being able to see so far ahead and realizing that it was just futile. I think he fought for as long as he could. But I mean, what would you do if you were faced with this type of threat? This 100,000-year-old creature from space that apparently can't die, can only be frozen in time, and you know, it was just brilliant writing in regards to that character.
That's the thing. They killed it however many times, but as they said, if just one particle of this thing gets loose, you know, they had like remain after remain after remain, and as you saw, it could not be killed very easily.
Never truly died. And that's like one of my favorite moments in the film is when you know, Mac and I forget the other character's name. They're sitting in that fire.
Fuchs.
And and they're basically like, well, what do we do now? And he's like, we go down with it, essentially, is what they say. They go down with the ship like any good captain does.
Oh, wait, you're talking at the end.
Yeah, I was talking about the end.
Okay, yeah, so the Keith David, the Childs character.
Yeah, Childs, thank you. That's the one. I mean, but that just sort of shows how these are all really smart people, you know?
Yeah, they're not dumb, typical horror characters.
Yeah, they're researchers, intelligent United States researchers, and, you know, they're brilliant-minded. And so once they realize at the end, it's like, we're not getting out of here. We just need to bring this thing down with us. I mean,
and if anything, it makes that even more terrifying, because these are like some of the smartest people around. And if they're becoming susceptible to like the paranoia of it all, again, it's freezing cold. They don't know who to trust. If they're becoming susceptible, oh man, that makes the stakes even higher than they already are.
What did your average Joe Schmo gonna do to this
thing?
Oh
my God,
exactly. I don't even want to know what that's like, to be honest with you. That sounds terrible.
Exactly. And that's what I'm saying. Like, again, very kind of eerily similar today. It's almost like this extraterrestrial force has kind of come over us, and we just like don't know who to trust, because we don't know if someone is gonna have this thing that may or may not be infecting us one by one. And it's so interesting to me because, again, even the people who were proved innocent, like with that blood test, they didn't necessarily know who to trust, because, again, every time they thought it was one person, it turned out it was somebody completely different. Like, that's how smart this thing became. And I think an underrated kind of character from that whole crew that's not talked about is the Fuchs character, the guy with the glasses, the guy who kind of figured out first after the Bennings character's death that this thing was still around and kicking, and that one of them was still up after studying Blair's notes when they locked up Blair. And then when they go outside to find him, they find out that he's burned himself because he was probably attacked in one, and realized futilely that he was going to get taken over, so he killed himself rather than be taken over. But that character, I thought, again, was another underrated character, and kind of how with each different character types, you know, with some of even the more goofier characters, you know, the Palmer character, you know, who is the pothead, and the Knowles character, who is like constantly playing like loud music on the stereo, and, you know, some of the more rational-minded characters, you know, even like the Clark character, who I really liked how that one, they kind of showed that like he had this like but kind of overly sentimental attachment to the dogs, because he kind of saw more, he kind of felt isolated even for the rest of his humans, and kind of saw more kinship with the dogs than he did with the humans. And that kind of caused, even that inspired like a little bit of suspicion, you know, because Blair told him when they went to check on him, like, watch Clark, you know, because he had the closest interaction with the dog, but then he was proved innocent. Like, this movie had so many different layers for a movie that's just about a basic monster like slasher setup, you know. It was really, really deep.
Yeah, that's what I'm glad you kind of like sort of painted that picture in, because the next point I was going to bring up was that sure, Kurt Russell is the clear lead, but it's very much so a true ensemble cast. And I just don't know what happened as time moved forward. Maybe I haven't seen a good example of an ensemble cast in the present day, but like, it's amazing to me in this 1 hour and 40-minute runtime, you get to know at least something personal with each character. Sure, some get more screen time than others, deservingly so, as they're more prominent in the screenplay, like the doctor character in Mac, for example. But like, you still get to know Child's personality. You still get to know, the guy with the dog's personality a little bit. Like you get to know a little bit about each of them. So inevitably, when their moment comes, spoiler alert, you feel something.
Yeah.
They're not just these throwaway horror characters.
Yeah.
And it almost makes me wonder what happened to this level of care and attention and just creativity, but also creativity backed with just good decision making in horror. Because I think arguably the genre right now is bigger than it's ever been. But to find a smart horror film is very few and far between. But the more I go back and the more I watch, for example, the original Halloween, say what you will about it, I think it still is a very tightly well-written movie. The Thing and, for example, like, Friday the 13th, they all, at least all the decisions made are smart. And that's why I think horror kind of came to the front of it, because we have these grandfather films at this point that sort of like allowed people to be like, okay, this is scary as fuck, but I think the real reason I like it is because it's a good movie. Basically watching this film makes me feel sad about where horror has kind of went. Sure, you have the hidden gems, but like, you know what I'm trying to say, man?
Yeah, and I definitely think that some of your problems can be attributed to the overall disposable nature of film now that has happened as a result of streaming, with the result of there's so much content that obviously, again, if you're going to find that that's where a lot of our problems with most movies nowadays come from, which is the fact that, again, because the overall disposable nature, because there is so much, the amount of thought and attention to detail, clearly just, it's impossible for that amount of attention to detail to be put into every movie. Again, it's the whole thing that we were talking about with Jeff, the idea of where does the balancing act come from. You either have all this stuff that, again, is just disposable, mindless entertainment until the next thing, or you have this one thing periodically that is kind of dictated to us, but at the very least we know that because there is all of this thought and effort that is put into this one effort, you at the very least can have an assumption that it is going to be good. It's a very tricky thing to go back and forth on, because again, there's good that comes from both, and there needs to be this balancing act overall. But I think that this movie shows more than anything else, this is what happens when you get a tight script, a director who knows what they're doing, people who are at the top of their game when it comes to production design, special effects design, sound design, all of that above, and a cast that, again, has to rely on the material, not their own individual flashy personalities in order to sell the story. There is something to be said about that. And again, when you get all of those things working together succinctly, to me, it doesn't matter what the genre is. It doesn't matter if it's horror. It doesn't matter if it's sci-fi. It doesn't matter if it's drama. It doesn't matter if it doesn't matter what the genre is. If you have all of those things working succinctly together, that to me is what makes for the best overall movie experience. And especially with this type of a scenario, when you've got all those things working together on top of the extra added layers that this movie has, that to me is what makes a great film. And again, it's unfortunately, again, I already feel like a fucking boomer, even though I'm only 23. And again, it's that type of attention to detail that we don't get with movies nowadays, because they're more concerned with how many products they can get out as opposed to how good each individual product can be. And again, it sucks because there's really kind of nothing we can do about it, because that's the kind of thought process of the day right now. We can kind of only just wait and see where things go from there.
Right, we're in a lightning speed society, and so because of that, things need to be turned out quicker. And so I definitely see your point there. And the thing is, though, man, it's just like, not that we don't have hidden gems, though, in the modern day. I mean,
absolutely,
you and I, we understand that, but it just sucks that like, it just seems to be that like horror kind of blew up because of these types of movies. But I just think the bar's only gone down since, like, I would say like the mid 90s, based off what I've seen in my life. But like, to your point, dude, I think it's like one of those things where, yeah, you're right. Everything in this film was interwoven so perfectly, but also, to add another layer to why I think this film's good, because I mean, look, we're rounding the corner on this podcast here, and I don't have anything bad to say about this movie, so I'm just going to keep painting the picture of to why I think it's so great. I did a little research, and to me, it feels like this film was right before Kurt Russell really became the star that he was. So it's not even like they were riding on the merits of him being like a larger than life star at the time. He was still genuinely kind of just getting his foot off the ground, taking the jobs he could get, and trying to, like, you know, buff his resume, to my understanding. Now, you know more history in this regard to actors and their careers, but correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's another strength of this film, you know, the fact that, like, sure, these guys went on to be stars, some of them, but they weren't really, you know, boating star power here to get butts and seats.
Yeah, the whole thing was that obviously the year before he'd started an Escape from New York, but yeah, like Kurt Russell was not like the Kurt Russell that we know of him today. You know, again, John Carpenter really helped contribute to that. Obviously, again, with his 3 big collaborations with Carpenter being some of his most iconic roles, Escape from New York, this movie, and then Big Trouble in Little China. But again, like, Kurt Russell kind of slides into the lead character status because he's kind of that take charge guy, you know, that's kind of established. He is established as the main character. But for the majority of the movie, he's just another one of the guys, you know. We know him as Kurt Russell because we know him as Kurt Russell now. But back then, like, they were just like, oh, Kurt Russell, you know, he'd been like in a couple of like early Disney things, needed like a couple of movie successes. But for the most part, like, he was still like a relative new and upcomer. So like that kind of movie star status, stardom hadn't really found him yet. So he really did have to carry this movie. I think it did an impressive job overall, but he worked with what he had. And what he had was, again, a lot of stuff that went towards his favor and a really freaking good cast. Like, that's the thing, is that even though, with the exception of Keith David and Wilford Brimley, this is a cast made up of majority character actors. Like, all of these actors did a phenomenal job. And I'm like, yeah, there's a reason why, after all this movie, even though a majority of these guys only have one name and kind of one character trait each, there's a reason why I remember each and every one of these guys. And I'm still struggling to remember some of the characters' names that I watched in a movie that I just watched like a couple days ago. You know, like, there is a reason for that to me overall, and why I constantly have to rely on the actors in order to remember, and I don't remember like a single character's name, you know? Like, there's just something to that. And so you mentioned real quick that we were rounding the corner on this podcast, and I think we've covered pretty much everything that I want to. Again, there really isn't that much bad that we can say about this. Again, this is an iconic movie for a lot of different reasons. There were just 2 more things that I wanted to bring up. One, the score, which is
we have
I talked to you a lot about, and I've mentioned this on every single.
Bring this up.
I had to, which is that I've mentioned this on almost every single podcast that I could, which is the idea of, obviously, the score is solely credited. It is Ennio Morricone. Rest in peace, who just recently passed away earlier this year. And again, it was the idea that Ennio Morricone had a much larger and more grandiose version of this score composed, and then when Carpenter listened to it, he used it for certain points, like the scene where they were exploring the Norwegian base and a couple of other scenes. But for the most part, you just have the dun 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 dun, you know, that very basic, very minimalistic Carpenter score. You know, Carpenter was known for making his own music in scores. Obviously, that Halloween score is iconic, to say the least. And it's so funny how understated that score is, but it just sells everything. Like, it's just this little beat, almost like a heartbeat, you know, and it's slowly amping up the tension without you even realizing it. And so much of this movie is silent, and it just relies on the pitch perfect sound design and everything. But again, thank God that he still did use that score, because, again, Quentin Tarantino later on would use that entirely unused score, I think, just for the opening overture for The Hateful Eight, which, again, is pretty amazing how he was able to do that overall, you know?
Yeah, dude. And, you know, nothing has said that this is the case, but Tarantino's done a few bottle films, Hateful Eight being one of them. And I have reason to believe that Tarantino may have learned a thing or two from this movie in particular. Yeah. I mean, just because I kind of feel like, and you know what? Earlier I was saying I couldn't really remember a point in time where I feel like ensemble casts in bottle films, the quality started to deteriorate. And I think Tarantino is kind of the last real example of doing a bottle film with, and as he went on in his career, Hateful Eight, a star-studded cast for the most part, but managing them and giving each of them a moment so that when, you know, things happen to the characters in these bottle films, as we know, you feel something more than just like, oh, cool, that's the plot in motion. You know, you feel pain for the characters, you feel their loss. And so I don't know if it's a fact or not, but I do feel what you're saying. And I think that there's got to be a connection there, considering he used the unused score from this movie. And the man has 2 phenomenal bottle films on his resume in Tarantino. And that's a really cool little interesting tidbit, man, because so what you're telling me then essentially is that because there is very minimal music, minimal amount of music in this movie, but when it hits, it hits.
Yes.
But so what you're telling me is Carpenter really only did the main theme then? I looked that up and I saw that he composed the main theme and the rest was not him. Okay.
Yeah. The rest was Morricone, but like the dun dun.
Right.
Dun dun. That was him. That was Carpenter.
That was Carpenter. And that's very Halloween-esque.
Very Halloween-esque. Again, very minimalistic, very basic. Halloween is what? Like the same 4 or 5 notes just played over and over again, just with different variations, right? I mean, you're the music guy, so.
It is, yeah. But it's brilliant.
It's brilliant. It's one of the most iconic movie scores of all time for a reason to me. And the last thing that I wanted to bring up is you mentioned Tarantino kind of taking the right lessons from previous films. I'll tell you one that did not take the right lessons specifically from this film, which was its own sequel, because unfortunately, this is another movie that was bastardized by a later entry, which is obviously the first half of the 2010s had the unfortunate mispleasantry of trying to force these kind of sequels / reboots of these movies down our throats. Friday the 13th was one of them, and the other one was this movie, which again, the balls that this, whatever the fuck that 2011 movie was, had to call itself a prequel is astounding, because while that movie might call itself a prequel, that movie to me was nothing but just a blatant remake of this movie, just with a shitty, more boring, modern-day cast and really terrible CG effects. Other than that, it's literally the same movie, and the only differences to me in that movie are points where it's just recreating, okay, now you know how this one thing that happened in the 82 movie happened in this movie, you know? And it's so much worse. The friggin' character decisions, of course, that's more of like a typical generic modern-day slasher movie. The characters make more dumb decisions. The CG looks awful. And the sad part is that movie was trying to use practical effects in order to pay homage to the original, and then it just ended up doing CG because I guess they thought it looked cooler and it was a cheaper alternative. And just the decisions that the actual creature itself in that movie made a lot less sense, because it was like now all of a sudden it's just shape-shifting random willy-nilly and attacking people random willy-nilly in like a group of people, as opposed to in this movie it has to kind of be like coaxed and forced out. It is trying to hide for the most part. Its concern is infiltration, not just straight up attack. You know, in that movie, the 2011 movie, the focus is very, very much more so on just like showing just how crazy this thing is, and that to me completely goes against the idea of the thing itself in general. So, yeah, and again, I have to differentiate by calling the 2011, because again, for it to be a prequel, it didn't even try to do anything different. It just called itself The Thing, just yet again.
Yeah, I've actually heard good things about that film, but I'm assuming you wouldn't recommend it.
No, not at all. And from the things that I've seen, I'm like, it's okay for like just like a mindless watch, but like even trying to compare it to this movie, the 82 version, is like pretty hilarious in my mind.
Yeah, that sounds like a mistake to me.
Yeah.
I think I will watch the 50s one first and then the 2011 one, because, dude, even though I know nothing's going to compare to this one, I want more of this universe. It's wild.
I don't know. I guess just my whole thought process is my only worry and my thought process on trying to do like differentiations on this is, again, like unless you're getting like the 50s version, which is like very clearly a different movie and not trying to be the same movie. I feel like trying to have other movies set within this verse, you kind of run into the same problem that the Alien movies are, which is that there's only so many directions you could go with. So as a result, you kind of just end up getting the same movie over and over again, you know? It's kind of why like I always was confused as to why they keep trying to make Alien and Predator movies. I'm like, this formula very clearly worked once, and to do something really different within this world, you gotta make it like a completely different movie, but the creators never want to really seem to do that. So it's like, and you wonder why you keep running into the same problem of seemingly getting the same movie over and over again, you know?
So you're telling me you didn't like Prometheus?
No. Please.
I know.
I was about to say,
I
I'm like, no. I know you love David Lindelof, but I'm not willing to give him credit for that fucking piece of shit.
When I talk about David Lindelof, if you've noticed, I always leave that out, don't I?
I wonder what that and Star Trek Into Darkness. Yeah, why.
Well, another, I know how to sell him. It's all about.
And I like Star Trek Into Darkness too. Is the funniest part, but
yeah, it's not terrible, but it's not his finest. Yeah. No.
Anyways, well, that one again. That one like they brought him in for reshoots and everything. But yeah, no, that was just those idiots, Kurtzman and Orsi. But yeah, so I think we've talked about everything that we can about this movie. So I guess, Chris, I want to hear, what are your final thoughts and star rating for 1982 John Carpenter's The Thing?
Yeah, usually I like to build up a little suspense here, but I just got to let everyone know this is a 5-star movie. I already love bottle films. I mean, they're amazing and they're brilliant. And just seeing this one with how, in regards to my experience with bottle films, I kind of feel like I can see just the way that this film impacted so many of the films that I've seen that have come after it that I love so much. And so it's really cool just to see, again, all the facets of filmmaking fired on all cylinders of this movie. We've spoken ad nauseum about it at this point. But the thing that I think got me the most, and I've said this a few times on this podcast, but just to drive home why it's 5 stars to me, is that every action garnered an emotional response from me, because I got to know the characters and I got to understand where they were coming from, and I understood the intensity of the situation, and I felt like I was in the world. And rarely does that honestly happen. That's why I said I'm going to have to revise my top movies of all time list and find a spot for this film in there. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. Dom, what is your star rating and final thoughts on this movie?
Yeah, my top 20 favorite movies of all time is still a fairly recent phenomenon, and it's a list that is constantly changing around as I get older and my thoughts and processes on this movie change. But I remember when I saw this movie and I'm like, okay, I was watching specifically, I think I was on the slasher portion of my film theory class at the time, and I'm like, okay, no, this movie is something different. This movie just goes so far above and beyond the typical slasher tropes that I fucking can't stand about most of those movies. And yeah, again, you hit the nail on the head with the idea that every single moment in this movie garners an emotional response, be it fear, sadness, what's it called, anxiety. Oh my God, you want to talk about a movie that garners freaking anxiety? Like, this to me is a perfect movie. Every single part, every single thing that is going for this movie works. This movie is a masterclass when it comes to craft, the way that it's directed, the way that the actors move, the way that the story progresses. This movie is just perfect from all standpoints, and I don't want to kind of try to repeat anything that you said. So yeah, this is absolutely, I don't know why I gave this movie only 4.5 the first time that I saw it. This is absolutely a 5-star movie. This is a perfect movie. I am perfectly comfortable when I say this is my favorite horror movie of all time, because I'm notoriously a person that likes horror parodies way more than actual horror movies. But this, I think, is the first straight horror movie that I actually love, that actually goes above and beyond the genre tropes and trends and cliches that I hate. And yeah, this is a perfect movie. Like, I can't wait to see where this ends up factoring into my top 20 of all time.
Me neither, man. At some point, we should do our top 20 lists.
Yeah.
I've been working on mine in the shadows since you started bringing it up.
I see.
And there's some movies that I don't think you'd ever guess would be in there for me.
Probably.
And it
That's
just
what I would
shows
like
how
about
much...
it.
Yeah, it just shows how much I think we still have yet to learn about each other. And speaking of learning about us, we are going to be on the Brando Show, which apparently is going to be a Joe Rogan style podcast. Where
I can't wait.
God, we're going to get into all sorts of stuff.
That's the case. Oh man. Oh, there are so many things that I want to get into on that show. But people, thank you once again for listening to another amazing episode of the Talkin TV podcast. Again, kind of the little bit more of a low-key episode than we were kind of intending, but this is officially going to be the kickoff episode for our big SHOCK-tober event. People, I can officially say it, every Friday of October, we will be on a different person's channel doing a different thing. This coming Friday, we will obviously be on Brando Critic, our good friend and collaborator, this new channel, the debut episode of the Brando Show. Then the following weekend, we will be on David of Flix Talks channel watching Candyman. The following weekend, we will be on Joe of Guy at the Movies channel watching Saw. Then after that, we will be on AJ of AJ Reacts 2 channel watching Tucker and Dale versus Evil. And then the end of the month on our own channel, Saturday, the 31st of October, Halloween, we will be wrapping it up with another Carpenter classic, the movie that I have famously said to me is one of the most overrated movies of all time. But needless to say, it's a cult classic regardless. We will be watching 1978's Halloween on Halloween, people. It's going to be a blast.
Bring your best costume.
We're going to have a lot of fun. We're going to be talking a lot of spooky stuff this month. But as usual, this wouldn't be the Talkin TV channel if we weren't getting you guys a bunch of different content every single Monday, Wednesday, and Friday right here on the YouTube channel. If you please would leave a like and a subscribe and click the little bell, that way you get notified every single time we put up new content. It would be greatly appreciated. Again, Talkin TV, no G. We put up content every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Chris is almost done with his Lovecraft Country recap, and that's going to be very interesting. Yeah. By the time this episode goes up, the recap for episode 7, I Am, will officially be up on the channel. And also, don't worry, keep coming back on Wednesdays for the main podcast episodes, because just as far as the actual podcast episode goes, we've got a lot of stuff planned as far as that goes. This is going to be an interesting month. I would venture to say that this might be our biggest and best month just as far as the straight-up podcast episodes go. I won't spoil what they're going to be, but it's going to be a lot of fun. So, Chris, where can the good people find us on the social media platforms?
Dom, I am so glad you asked. All you have to do is look right below us and go to anywhere that matters. Instagram, Facebook, at Talkin TV Podcast. Talkin spelled TALKIN', no G. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Subscribe, follow, turn on that bell for notifications, guys. And Dom, I mean, I really feel like you hit the nail on the head here. So unless you have anything else to add, maybe a message for the people?
Watch more fucking movies, people. We out.